Hello and welcome back. My name is Toy. This is the second video for the attack line design guide. In this video, we're going to be going over openers. Like I said in the first video, I'm going to be using Sub-Zero and his attack lineup kind of as the base point for going through this list. And I'm also going to bring in some other examples, and we're just going to talk about openers in this. So an opener in its most basic form of, as I've laid out here, sets up other attacks in your lineup for that turn. It will set up the game state, or it gives you information, and then it often creates a lose-lose situation for the opponent. At its most simplest form, an opener is just going to be the card that you ideally want to play first every time. I know that's super simplifying things, but that's really what it is. Every time that you are going to go in for an attack string, and by string I mean like around like 3+ attacks, the first attack that you're playing needs to serve a dedicated purpose to being the first attack. Otherwise, you run into awkward situations where you're using pieces, like you're not taking best advantage of the slot. Like, I don't know if that's the best way to put it. Like, I don't want to be opening up with something meaty and then something that takes advantage of specific situations and then miss out on that later on because I'm just not setting up my turns properly, like I'm overloading in other places, especially when there's these extra effects and there's extra stuff that I can gain by taking advantage of that opening attack. Like, there's just certain things in that situation that occur that aren't in other stages of the turn, right? So specifically when you play the first attack in your lineup, that is the moment where your opponent is most often going to have the most number of cards in their hand, okay? So that is one of the most typical game states when you're going in for that first attack. And just even that knowledge alone, the fact that that is the time when your opponent has the most cards in their hand, that information can be used to your advantage. So certain effects are more valuable when your opponent has more cards in their hand. So on top of that, it is when both you and your opponent will have the most ready foundations. So then there's effects that are going to take advantage of that situation. And it's the most known game state. Right? So at the beginning of your turn, when you're going to go and attack in on somebody, you don't know what the game state's going to be like come your third attack. You have some guesses and you have some good estimations, but that's not for sure. But the first attack, when you're about to go in, you can take time, you can read your side of the board, your opponent's side of the board, you can look through discard piles, and you can make the strongest estimation you can at that point. And you have all this information. So the first attack, you need to be running attacks that can take advantage of the information that you can gain from there. They can take advantage of the specific things that occur on that first run, right? You can often play cards that are a little bit higher difficulty, a little bit riskier, because again, your staging area is not committed, it's not tapped out yet. So you can use that first attack to be riskier, because if you succeed on that first initial risk, then you know you can start playing a little bit safer as things go on, and you still have the resources to dedicate. But if things go poorly right in the beginning, then you can deviate and change your plan. Like, there's all these different things. So let's look at Sub-Zero. All right. So looking at his attack lineup, because we are Sub-Zero, and he has an innate ability where he can just flip one foundation to seal one of your opponent's assets or foundations. He kind of helps make everything kind of operate as an opener, so to speak. He also has the ability where your stun attacks get +2 damage, and then if they're blocked, your opponent discards one card. Because he's a stun-based deck, and stuns tend to be good openers, a lot of his basic attack lineup, even though he has one card that really works well as an opener, lots of his stuff can kind of be pseudo-openers, even for other characters, because they can kind of fill similar functions. Okay, anything in his lineup that has a stun 2 on it, right? Icy Burst being one of them. Actually, Icy Slide's not the greatest opener. Let's not use that. But Defreeze. Defreeze is. Defreeze and Icy Burst are two really good openers. Another really good opener from him is Ice Ball, even though it doesn't have stun 2 on it, it's still a really good opener. And the other ones are all kind of not really what we want to be looking at. Right? They work as it because they do have stun and they do have effects that kind of change things, but they're not primarily for that function, so let's not look at those right now. We're going to look at these three, okay? So first we're going to look at Ice Ball and why it's a good opener. So does it set up other attacks, or does it set up the game state? So it says on here, enhance, if this attack's not blocked, you can seal your opponent's character and commit it. So what this creates is it kind of creates a lose-lose situation for our opponent. So it doesn't set up the game state necessarily unless they hand it to us, but we're putting a lose-lose situation on the board. And it's going to kind of help us gain information as well. So we're presenting a mid attack, okay? All this thing needs to be is blocked by our opponent in order for us not to get this effect off. So we can play this and we can get the stun, which helps set up the game state to a degree, depending on what our game plan is. But then it forces our opponent, depending on what our opponent's playing, if they're playing something that they want to keep online for the turn, right? So now this is going back to gaining information. So if our opponent has a defensive ability and we throw this attack at them and they don't block and they just let their character get committed, this starts giving us information about what our opponent's doing. So either A, they are unable to block, and then we can play a hit confirm after that to try and test out our theory and see if they can't answer something. And if they can't answer the second thing either, then we know we can extend. Or they have an alternative plan to deal with your attack string. And if they have an alternative plan to deal with your attack string, then again, you're going to need to play another attack to kind of feel that out. But this is starting to give us that that information, like I just said. So it helps you in that regard. The lose-lose situation that this thing presents is if they want to keep their character ready, they have to block this attack, even if they necessarily don't want to dedicate the card in their hand to block it, especially when you're playing Sub-Zero, because if they block, they have to discard a card. So they're paying 2 cards out of their hand in order to block this Ice Ball. So specifically in Sub-Zero, Ice Ball becomes very useful, but that's kind of matchup depending. If your opponent's playing a character that they don't care if the thing's committed or if they commit it themselves on their turn, all of a sudden Ice Ball's value plummets and it becomes a very poor opener, which is why a lot of decks you don't see run this card, because it's situational in its role, right? Because when it's not being a good opener, it kind of doesn't fill the other spots very well at all. Then it just turns into a 4 difficulty 3/3 stun 1 that your opponent doesn't really care about otherwise. So this thing's kind of niche. It could be functional as a sideboard card, just based on that regard, as a strong opener in certain situations and certain matchups. All right, then we're going to look at Ice Burst. Ice Burst is a strong opener because it has a stun 2 on it, which by itself is just really good, right? Because I can throw out the Ice Burst, knock over 2 foundations, and then just use that to play higher speed stuff later on, and they have a more difficult time dealing with it. That's just, standard UFS. Stun has just been a strong kind of opening ability since the game's foundation. It also has an ability, discard 1 momentum, seal 1 of your opponent's foundations. This comes in handy, so if you manage to play a turn 2 where you can get a poke in, gain momentum, then turn 3 or turn 4 when you're actually wanting to play longer strings, the Ice Burst can open up. You can discard that momentum, seal a foundation, and still stun 2. You're going to want to stun 2, then discard the momentum to seal something that they've left up, mostly. So that's just kind of how this card works. Unlike the Ice Ball, this card still stays relevant depending on the matchup. It's far more relevant more often. It also has better block and just better numbers overall. 4 speed's a really good number to have on an attack that has stun on it. Just all that kind of stuff, right? And it still gains you some information on the fact that you're playing Sub-Zero if they have to block, that kind of thing. If you're not playing Sub-Zero, it doesn't gain you nearly as much information as you'd like, because 4 damage is something that your opponent can just take. It's not really worth the full block unless they're playing a low vitality or you've already poked them down quite a bit and they don't have much vitality to give you. So it kind of depends on the situation at the game state as to how much information this card can give you, but in terms of an opener, it's still good. It can still carry that hat. I more classify Ice Burst around like a bread and butter type card. It's really good as a bread and butter card to play alongside another game plan, whether it be a sealing game plan or a stun game plan, whatever that is, especially for subs. Great card, bread and butter wise. But as an opener, it's a functional for like a secondary opener that I would run, right? And then the primary opener that Sub-Zero got is Deep Freeze. Okay, this card's a phenomenal opener, and I think I mentioned this in my Sub-Zero build. This card slowly replaced Hyper Bomb. Hyper Bomb being another phenomenal opener card, but much for the same reasons, why I'm not covering it for this. Deep Freeze, 5 difficulty, 3 mid 7. It has stun 2 on it, so that alone's great. However, much like the Ice Burst, it has a discard 1 momentum cost to seal 3 of your opponent's foundations and get more stun out of it. Okay, so let's look it up. Let's check. So opener, does it set up other attacks or set up the game state? Yes, it sets up the game state in such a fantastic way, even by itself, not on Sub-Zero, okay? You can play this card, again, if you've managed to poke momentum through, turn 3, turn 4, you're going to push through long string for a kill. Play this card out first. You can discard your momentum, seal 3 of your opponent's problem foundations right out of the gate. They're just taken care of. Then you get the stun 3 off, which is further reducing your opponent's ability to block subsequent attacks, right? Incredible. Another thing that makes this attack incredible is that it carries a high damage in exchange for a low speed. Why is that good for an opener? It's good for an opener because it really encourages your opponent to block it. Okay, which means that, like, if they don't have a way to deal with the damage, naturally they're going to have to use a card out of their hand just to chump this thing out. And if you've designed your attack lineup properly and you still have finishers that can do far more than 7 damage, whether or not they block the 7 tells you a lot about how your opponent's planning, right? So if they're throwing their blocks and their defenses into your deep freeze, well, then all that tells you some things. Again, if your opponent's intelligent and they know what you're capable of and what your strings can do, they probably have an answer for something further down the line. Or they're in a situation where they know, and judging by the game state, if you're already stunning them out by this point, they may have decided that they can't actually deal with anything further down the line, especially if you get more stun off. So they're going to dedicate what resources they have left currently to deal with the damage you're presenting to them right now, in hopes that you don't have anything following up. And if you can kind of read the situation and see that that's the case, especially if you can follow up with an Ice Burst and put some damage on this, that's a good way to confirm after the deep freeze to see if they can deal with more of your attacks, or how they're going to deal with more of your attacks, right? So deep freeze becomes an incredible opener. Like, it does all these wonderful things. And then in Sub-Zero, it's even more so by the fact that you can put more damage on it, and you can make that block cost even more, and you can get more of the opening effect that you want based on Sub-Zero. This just turns into a phenomenal package, right? And I mentioned this in the sub build. Absolutely incredible, right? And this is the kind of thing that you want to look for in an opening. Hyper Bomb was the same way. It was a stun 2. It really demanded that your opponent block it and deal with it. It didn't have as much damage, but very similar way, right? It's stun 2, and you could do a permanent destruction out of it, so it functioned as a utility card as well, and sacrifice a little bit of his opener value. But it still gets run a lot, and it's still phenomenal in a lot of decks. These two cards are in high competition for that opening slot. So other strong openers, I just pulled out 2 more examples of really strong openers. This one being Slaughterhouse. Really good. 5 difficulty, 3 cost. It has 6 speed, 4 damage, and it says enhance your high or low attacks, get +2 damage for the rest of the turn. So this card again, let's go through, right? Does it set up the attack or game state for set up other attacks or the game state? Yes, of course it does. It sets up all the other attacks in your chain, whether they're high or low, to gain 2 more damage. Does it gain you information? Kind of and kind of not really. If your opponent, basically when you play Slaughterhouse, your opponent's kind of left with a couple of decisions to make. If they think if you're playing this as a poke, what they're probably going to do is then they have to decide whether or not they're going to block it or not. Because it's a 6 speed, it takes a lot of resources to block, so either they have to dedicate speed reduction to it, or they're going to have to commit foundations to pass it, because the average check is 6. Average block is usually 1 or higher. There's not very many 0+ mids running around these days, other than the character-based decks. So they're typically going to have to commit 1 to 2 foundations, just regardless, to deal with this thing, to prevent 4 damage if they want to full block it, as long as they don't have other means to deal with it. But their primary concern, if they think you're going to push out a long string, their primary concern is going to be to cancel that E, right? And if they cancel that enhance, what that tells you is that they're afraid of the following attacks and how much damage you're going to put on them, because they probably don't have a way to deal with the following attacks absolutely, if that makes sense. Like, they won't be able to just full block everything and chain block things and just laugh in your face. So that tells you that you're going to be able to get some attacks through if you continue to attack, because your opponent is more concerned about the amount of damage that you're going to get through with those following attacks than they are specifically about the Slaughterhouse itself or other things, right? Whereas if they let this thing go through and they take the damage, then they're probably pocketing defensive strategies for following attack strings, or for finishers, or for anything that can just do lethal. Or they think that or they're trying to call your bluff and they think this is just being played as like maybe a poke, and they're just not concerned about taking 4 damage, right? And giving you the momentum. So it can kind of give you resources that way. Creates a lose-lose situation for the opponent. Yes and no. Like I said, they have to commit resources in order to block it. So if you're playing this thing as an opener, this card's really good, because you can still, after playing this thing, if you hit them with it, you can then at that point decide just build, take the momentum, and then carry on your turn, not dedicating too much to it. Because like I said, lots of times with this card, your opponent's just going to take the 4 damage regardless, and they're going to go with the bet of it could just be played as a poke, it could be played as an opener, and they're concerned about finishers. So if they're really concerned about the finishers following Slaughterhouse, like with Rain Flush typically gets paired out with this card. If they're concerned about a Rain Flush and they're saving their Enhanced Negation or anything for that kind of card, then you might be able to sneak in free Slaughterhouses, right? So it's a good card in that regard. It's just it's very classic as an opener. At least it was in the previous meta. I say pre-Bebop power level, because it set up your other attacks really, really well. It's just a good card for that, and it had some great numbers on it. But like I said, it served as an off poke, and it kind of gave you some weird information that way. Go Shoryuken. This is another great opener. You'll notice that a lot of openers are 5 difficulty. Some of them are 6 difficulty. That's kind of the ballpark. 5 is great for an opener. This card has an R card pool effect. After you play this card for the rest of this turn, your opponent cannot play abilities that modify the difficulty of your cards. So already it's setting up the game state and protecting your other attacks, right? So it's setting you up to make your other attack line safe. And then E, lose 2 vitality. If your opponent has 3 or more cards in hand, they discard a card. So again, first attack of the turn, when your opponent's most likely to have the most cards in your hand, so that's when you're going to be wanting to play this card, right? It's going to have the maximum value played first, because that's most likely they're going to have most cards, most likely you're going to rip one out of that. Then it has powerful 2 on it, okay? So much in the same way that Deep Freeze kind of demanded a block because of its damage, for 1 momentum, you can throw 2 more damage on this thing, put it at 7, and now, again, you're putting it into a range where your opponent's going to want to block this thing, right? So it kind of can function in a similar fashion, where if they have 3 or more cards in their hand, you can lose 2 vitality to make them lose 1. Then you can put some damage on this thing in order to encourage them to block it. Especially if you have another card, again, like a Rain Flush, where you can throw a Rain Flush after, use this as the cost, and then multiple it out for more damage than this thing would have been, more than the damage you would have put on this thing in order to bait out the other block, right? That's kind of how your math works when you're doing attack lineups, is how much damage are you actually getting for the resources you put in. So if you can consume a block because of that, rather than just get 5 damage through on this and then get less damage through later on, then that's how you want to kind of work those numbers. Yeah, so hopefully that kind of helps you look at openers a little bit more to what their functions are, and like how to use them. And when you're picking cards to put into your attack lineups and put into your decks, just kind of think about, okay, what attack am I going to typically want to play first all the time, or am I going to ideally want to look for? And some decks even become reliant on these cards, because they're what ensure your ability to secure kills, right? They're what give you the damage reach to kill, or they're what give you the delivery method in order to get your finishers through. Yeah, a lot of openers will typically stick to a theme of whatever your character's attack lineup theme is, right? Or your delivery method. So for Deep Freeze and Sub-Zero, it's typically stun, followed up by Frost Hammers, sped up by sealed attacks, right? So that's where Deep Freeze becomes good. Whereas if you're playing decks like Rushdown decks that want to play lots of attacks, Go Shoryuken becomes really good, because it prevents your opponent from being able to modify the difficulty of your cards. And like I said, you can encourage them to block on this one on top of the discard, so you're consuming cards from their hand, making it more difficult for them to block subsequent attacks, right? So you're kind of following along with what I'm trying to say. And then, yeah, you can find cards that can kind of function as both. They can still work decently as an opener and fill in other roles. And then finally, you have those niche openers that are matchup specific that end up being really good as sideboard cards if you have the space. So hopefully that helps a little bit. The next one I'll be doing is Bread and Butter. And yeah, till next time, this is Toy.